What if you looked inward right now and found nobody home? Not in a dramatic existential crisis kind of way, just quietly, no center. No little narrator behind your eyes tying your life into a story, just thoughts and feelings arriving and leaving with nothing in the middle holding them together. For most people, that idea is unsettling. For a small number of people, it's just Tuesday. It's how they've always experienced being alive. This video is about them and about a 100-year-old, unfinished Austrian novel that may be the closest thing literature has ever produced to a user manual for living without a self. Most people walk around with what philosophers call a narrative self. You experience your life as a story. There's a you from childhood, a you from last year, and a you right now, all strung together on a single thread with someone something sitting at the center of that thread doing the experiencing. This isn't just a philosophical idea, it's baked into how we live. We assume a stable self is what makes morality possible, what makes meaning possible, what makes you you. But some people don't experience this at all. There's a real account from a literary scholar who has spent years studying autobiography and life writing for a living, of having no felt center of awareness whatsoever, no locus where experience seems to land, no strong emotional thread connecting today to the past. Memories show up more like a resume than a story, useful facts, but emotionally distant, like reading about someone else's life. This person was even evaluated for borderline personality disorder at one point, since inner emptiness and an unstable sense of identity are listed as symptoms. The verdict came back psychologically healthy, just different. One clinician even warned them kindly that describing this experience to other doctors might come across as pathological, even though it wasn't. So here's someone who studies stories about the self professionally, while having almost no story about themselves personally. That contradiction is the engine of everything that follows. Western literature is, in many ways, a giant machine for building selves out of memory. Take a 6-volume, 3,000-page autobiographical project by a Norwegian writer, tracing one life from early childhood all the way to the moment of writing, one continuous, unbroken thread of identity. Or go back further to an even longer French classic from the early 20th century, built entirely around the act of recovering a single life through memory, in almost unbearable sensory detail. Both are monuments to the idea that you are your story. That selfhood is something you build, brick by remembered brick, until it stands tall enough to call a life. For someone who experiences no such center, no such thread, that's not just unfamiliar, it's a kind of cultural exile. Imagine spending a career studying the architecture of selves other people seem to have effortlessly built, while standing on ground that never quite solidified under you. That isolation is real, but it's also exactly the kind of gap that one specific, strange, unfinished novel was written to fill. The novel is The Man Without Qualities by the Austrian writer Robert Musil. It's enormous, philosophical, and fittingly never finished. Musil died before he completed it. Its title sounds at first like a diagnosis. A man without qualities, surely that means a man in crisis, someone who's lost himself. That's the assumption almost everyone brings to it because our culture treats a stable self as the baseline of health. But Musil meant something closer to the opposite. His protagonist, Ulrich, isn't a man who's lost a self. He's a man who never needed one fixed self to begin with, and who treats that as an opening, not a wound. Philosophically, this lines up with something much older than the novel, the Buddhist teaching of anatta, or no self, the idea that the sense of a central observer inside us is itself an illusion. There's no one behind experience, there's just experience, arising, passing, arising again. Musil fuses that with a scientific account of personhood, drawn partly from the physicist-philosopher Ernst Mach, on whom Musil wrote his own doctoral thesis. In this view, echoing the philosopher David Hume's old bundle theory, the self isn't a thing. It's a loose, ever-shifting bundle of sensations, more like weather than like a statue. So no center, no fixed essence, and in Musil's telling that's not a tragedy, it might be a kind of freedom. The novel's most striking idea comes through Ulrich's relationship with his estranged sister, Agge. When they reunite as adults after years apart, they're struck by how alike they look, almost interchangeable. From there, the two retreat from society into their late father's house and begin an intense, almost meditative exploration of identity itself, studying mystical and contemplative texts, blurring the line between their two minds. Their bond eventually becomes romantic, even incestuous, and it's worth pausing on that because it's easy to read it as shock value. Musil frames it differently, as an extreme thought experiment, a borderline case, the way mathematics sometimes pushes toward the absurd in order to discover a truth that ordinary numbers couldn't reach. The point isn't the taboo. The point is what happens when two people stop experiencing themselves as firmly separate. What they're reaching for, Musil calls the other condition, a state where the everyday boundary between observer and observed simply dissolves. Where the usual feeling of I'm in here, the world is out there, gives way to something both more intense and somehow emptier, total clarity and total dissolution at once, like standing at the edge of bright water where everything on the far shore looks too sharp, too vivid, almost painful to look at. It's not numbness, it's the opposite, heightened presence, but without a fixed self standing at the center of it, watching. Crucially, Musil isn't proposing that l�𝒗𝒊𝒏𝒈 live there permanently. He suggests ordinary, bounded selfhood is probably necessary just to function, to survive, to act in the world. What he's describing instead is a movement, a kind of oscillation between the ordinary, demarcated self and this boundless other condition, between the I and something larger, between solid ground and open water. Here's why this isn't just literary trivia. Modern neuroscience has, so far, found no single location in the brain that functions as a center of awareness, no anatomical seat of the self. Philosophers like Parfit Galen Strawson have independently challenged the idea that a coherent life narrative is necessary for meaning or morality at all. Strawson has gone as far as arguing, in a well-known essay, that you don't actually need to be a story to live a full and ethical life. And there's a quietly fascinating historical thread underneath all of this. Some scholars, including the philosopher Alison Gopnik, have suggested that Hume's skepticism about a fixed self may trace back to Buddhist ideas, possibly passed to him through Jesuit missionaries familiar with Tibetan and Theravada thought while Hume was studying in France. East and West, arriving at the same conclusion about the self from very different directions, centuries apart. None of this proves the no-self experience is correct for everyone, but it does mean it isn't fringe and it isn't damage. It's a minority way of experiencing existence that shows up independently across contemplative traditions, analytic philosophy, and apparently at least one Austrian novel that never even got finished. So what do you actually do with a philosophy like this if it's yours? Not despair, Musil's novel suggests something more like practice, moving deliberately between the everyday, bounded self you need to function and moments of looser, more dissolved awareness, almost like a discipline. Meditation does this. So, for some people, does deep immersion in fiction, losing your boundaries inside someone else's story for a while, then coming back. That might be why someone with no fixed sense of self can still find books and other people's narratives so absorbing, not despite the emptiness, but because of it. A loose boundary lets more in. You don't need to share this experience to take something from it. Even people with the strongest, most continuous sense of self can borrow the practice, the deliberate, occasional letting go of the story you tell about yourself, not forever, just enough to remember that the story was always a kind of useful fiction, one version of how a life could be told, not the only one. Robert Musil never finished The Man Without Qualities. He died with the ending still undecided, buried in drafts and notes that suggest several different directions the story might have taken. In a strange way, that unfinished quality is the philosophy. No tidy ending, no final, settled self, just an ongoing process, always becoming, never quite arriving, which, if you've been paying attention for the last 10 minutes, might be the most honest ending any story about identity could have.